Hi guys, here we are with the next in the series of the OCR A-Level specification, just plugging the gaps in the video playlists, and today I'm looking at this whole notion of the minimum price. Now, as you can see, I have not written out the full criterion from the spec because I did that already in the previous video on maximum prices, so it's the same explain, use a diagram with regard to minimum price rather than maximum. Okay, so let's get straight to it then. So when we're talking about minimum prices, we are thinking about a number of various scenarios with regard to things that you might be asked about. So it could be with regard to agricultural markets and offering farmers a guaranteed minimum price in order to give them a reasonable income on which to live. It could be the work of Professor Richard Thaler with regard to behavioural nudging, and it could be therefore a behavioural nudge in the direction of reducing consumption of a particular product. And obviously a recent one would be in Scotland with regard to the introduction of a minimum price for alcohol per unit in order to try to deter consumption of alcohol. Or finally, it could be a slightly different diagram, certainly in terms of labelling anyway, a labour markets diagram, to do with equity issues and redistribution issues with regard to introducing a minimum wage. And of course we've had that in the UK since Tony Blair introduced that in May 1997 to try to encourage people to get into work, give them an incentive to work. Okay, so let's, without further ado, pardon me, let's get straight to the diagram. So here we have the diagram: price, quantity, demand, supply, and this is our equilibrium at P star. Now, in order for the minimum price to be effective, obviously, the minimum price has to be above P star. So the minimum, you can see that as a floor, and therefore you don't want the price dropping below the floor. Well, if you're at equilibrium and you put the minimum price below equilibrium, well, if the market's in equilibrium, you wouldn't fall any further than that anyway. So the minimum always has to appear above the equilibrium level. And we just simply draw that on, same way as the guaranteed maximum, straight line across. So this is intervention by the government. Normally, of course, any intervention by the government into a free market, which might otherwise have cleared at the equilibrium, intervention generally leads to a few problems. And we can see immediately, and we'll have a little analysis here of what those problems are. So when the minimum price is introduced, we now have a demand here, where the minimum price hits the demand curve, and we have a supply here at B, where the minimum price hits the supply curve. You can clearly see, ladies and gentlemen, that in this instance, supply is greater than demand. And of course that stands to reason. Who in their right mind, if guaranteed a certain minimum price, would not wish to supply more into the market? I mean, it's in your interest as a producer, as a firm, as a supplier. And supply increases, obviously, because as price goes up, then you get this expansion of the supply curve. But similarly, as price goes up, of course, individuals, consumers, are deterred from consuming. And so we get a contraction in demand. So we get this divergence between supply heading off in this direction and demand heading off in this direction. And that then creates this problem where supply is consequently greater than demand. So you may have heard this discussed often with regard to agricultural markets and the whole notion of wine lakes and butter mountains and so on and so forth, whereby, excuse me, farmers, when they're guaranteed a certain price, well, if you're guaranteed a price and you're also guaranteed that whatever surplus you produce, the government will buy it up, then you will absolutely do your darndest to produce as much as you can. And so you'll produce, in this instance, B, and that surplus will be bought up by the government at this minimum price. So really, you don't need to worry about, well, if I produce all this, who's going to sell it, who's going to buy it rather, because you know exactly who's going to buy it, the government. And so it's in your interests to obviously maximise your output and hence maximise your revenue. Your revenue being from here to here to here, that entire rectangle. So you can see that's a bit of a boon, but obviously you can also see that we've got a bit of government failure going on here, because this very policy encourages overproduction and oversupply, sort of misallocation of resources in that respect. So what about in other instances? So we talked about minimum alcohol prices. Well, if you're sort of considering this and the pros and cons and the evaluation of that, do think about, well, the nanny state. Is it right that the government should constantly be telling us smoking's bad for you, alcohol's bad for you, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other? So people would, from the point of view of just a nanny state being too interventionist, not appreciate this type of government intervention, apart from the fact that it puts the price up. It's also regressive in nature, because it is empirically shown that the groups in society who tend to consume the most alcohol tend to have the least amount of disposable income, and so you're penalising those who can least afford it. It's very regressive in that respect, a bit like VAT. And it also doesn't really work unless it's universally introduced. So here, of course, in the UK, we have this minimum price has been introduced for alcohol in Scotland. Well, if you live anywhere near the border of Scotland and you wish to purchase some alcohol, well, what will you do? You just get in the car and you'll drive a few miles across the border. It's not there at the moment, of course, physically, but you'll drive a few miles in your car and into England, and then you can just buy the alcohol without the minimum price on it. Now, obviously, that's geographically difficult, dependent upon where you live, but it is still possible, and that again interferes with the effectiveness of such a policy. And then finally, think about the incentives. Now, I do have another couple of videos for minimum wage. I'll put a little card up for that. But think about the incentives to work with regards to minimum wage. It does create that incentive to work. The whole point is that it's supposed to make work pay in that respect. You're helping to redistribute income more equitably. So think about your Lorenz curve and your Gini coefficient. But also, of course, the theoretical notion would be, if this were supply of labour and demand for labour, and you have minimum wage here, not minimum price, well, you'd have an excess supply in the same, this diagram is the same, excess supply of labour, that's unemployment theoretically. Well, again, in reality, whilst that was very much muted at the time, with minimum wage going to create lots of unemployment, it didn't actually prove to be the case. So what goes on in theory, what goes on in reality, I'm sure you know well by now, ladies and gentlemen, your study of economics, they are not always one in the same. Indeed, very often, very, very often not. Okay, ladies and gents, just going to leave it at that. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, thank you. If you don't subscribe, hit that subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get all the latest updates. I am updating and uploading once a day. And follow me on other social media, Instagram, that's G_Economics, LinkedIn, G_Economics, and follow my events on www.geekonomics.co.uk/events. If you're trying to contact me on my webpage via the email, hello@geekonomics.co.uk, it's not working at the moment, so do bear with me whilst I get that fixed. Bye for now.